to our final Innovative Cities lecture for the semester. We're excited that you're joining us. We're going to start with our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge in Milwaukee that we are on traditional Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee homeland along the southwest shores of Michigamme, North America's largest system of freshwater lakes, where the Milwaukee, Menominee, Kinnickinnic rivers meet, and the people of Wisconsin's sovereign Anishinaabe, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Oneida, and Mohican nations remain present. We do this each time. We really encourage you to click on the map, explore some additional resources. It's important to understand culturally and create that connection with your community. So again, welcome. I'm Carolyn Eswine. I'm Associate Professor here, School of Architecture and Urban Planning. We're excited today to have Dr. Sri Vedachalam with us. He is going to talk about a variety of topics related to equity in water. So water and environmental justice, sharing some of the lessons that he has experienced in his projects, and giving us some ideas about how do we integrate equity in water into our projects and a path forward. If you have questions or comments while the presentation is going on, please type it in the chat. And in some cases, I will interject, and other times we will save some of our questions and discussion for the end. So just by way of introduction, Sri is the Director of Water Equity and Climate Resilience with Corvias Infrastructure Solutions, and he's going to share a variety of projects both locally and nationally with us. So welcome.
Thank you, Caroline. I'm excited to talk about water and environmental justice. This is something we've been hearing recently, so I'm guessing you've come across some of these terms: disadvantaged, underserved, disinvested, marginalized, low income. They mean slightly different things, but I think the intent behind using those terms is to signify that a set of people, a community, a neighborhood, a city, a set of residents have been left behind in some way. We haven't paid attention to them, or they have been unjustly suffered as part of infrastructure development, the process of progress. So there is this sort of common definition of environmental justice, which was developed fairly in a comprehensive way several years ago, that just talks about not just the fair treatment of people and not just outcomes, but also involvement. So it talks about meaningful involvement in the process, not just saying that if you have a program, it should be fair to everyone, but also that people should have engagement in developing that program. So you take their views into account, engage them meaningfully, and then do not discriminate. Some of this is legal language now. You will see in many programs. It's a little sort of so think of I'm going to introduce another topic, which is equity. They're sort of related, so I just thought I'll make a distinction here. This is a definition of health equity, which again somewhat related to environmental justice. It talks about just opportunity. People should be healthy, removing obstacles, structural barriers such as poverty, discrimination, providing them giving them good access to jobs and fair pay and all that. So if you want to think of it, think of environmental justice as a goal. You want to have big goals like world peace, or solve poverty and hunger. But then equity can be your process. It can be the objectives. So it can be simple steps that we can sort of follow along, and then in that process get closer and closer to our overall goal. So, so in this case, we get closer and closer to environmental justice. Race is now a strong predictor of water and sanitation access in the US. So you have Native American communities, you have communities of color, especially in the South, poor communities and places like West Virginia. You'll see that, those are correlated. They have poor access to water and sanitation. And that, shouldn't be the case. And this is a result of years of structural discrimination, poor policy making that we have followed. So I'm going to talk about some of those in how we see those in practice, and what are the steps we have been taking and we could take to address some of these challenges. So as most problems are not created today. They're not even yesterday's problems. They're problems that came as a result of choices that we made several years ago, hundreds of years ago. even going back to, human migration, slavery, how it evolved has shaped some of our decisions even today. So let's start with, water systems in the US. These are drinking water systems, which are separate from wastewater systems. In some cases, wastewater systems also handle stormwater, anything that comes, in the form of precipitation, rain, snowfall, etc. So you have drinking water systems that are separated along this axis. So you have percentage of population served on the x-axis, and the number of systems, the percentage of water systems on the y-axis. So you'll see that very small systems are a large majority, 55% of our water systems in the country. We have 50,000, nearly 50,000 independent water systems in the US, and 50% of them, so about 25,000, are really small. And when I say small, they serve less than 500 people. That's really small. And then as you get bigger and bigger, the percentage, their percentage in the overall system becomes smaller. So when you get to the largest systems, which are systems like Milwaukee, New York City, I'm not sure if Milwaukee is that big enough, but I think it might be. Think of any big system, city of Chicago, New York City, Austin, any sort of big city has a, fairly large system that serves, 1 million people plus. That'll be, they serve half the population. They're only 1% of the total system. And so this by itself doesn't mean anything. But the problem is that the larger the system, the more resources they have, the more resilient to shocks they are, any kind of shock, economic shock, a climate shock, a flood, tornado, fire, any kind of hazard. They're able to weather that storm. Think of a recession, think of a company shutting down in that city and those staff leaving that city. That can be devastating to a small town of 500 people or 1,000 people, but it maybe not as catastrophic to a city of 1 million people. So as a result of that, these smaller systems are really on the brink of collapse anytime something like that happens. You can have equity in policy. So lead service lines is a topic that's, I think, fairly well known to people in the Midwest. So this is a map of where lead service lines are. You'll see the Midwestern states popping bright red, states like Ohio, Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, New York State. I mean, all of these are hotspots. They have, several thousands, in many cases, million plus lead service lines in each state, amounting to a total of about 12 million pipes. Now, these are concentrated again in older houses, poor houses that, low-income individuals live. Sometimes they are concentrated in government housing, what are called project housing, which, again, were built in the 70s and 80s, and those have, a lot of lead pipes. So you can have, you can address equity in these issues and start to look at, how a certain set of people are more impacted by the same environmental issue as compared to their more wealthy, probably white counterparts. We can look at equity in implementation. Even take the example of lead. If you say we now have a government program that will address or remove these lead pipes, and then you say, but you have to pay, each person who's living in that house has to pay, let's say, $1,000, and then the government would chip in another 1,000 or 2,000, and then we can all, get together and replace these pipes. Now, who's going to be able to afford those, those $1,000 is a question where you start to see inequity again. More wealthy residents will start to replace their pipes faster than, the low-income folks. This is another example. That's something that I'm working on. We look at, again, equity in implementation in a city like Chicago. This is a program called Space to Grow. It got a shout out from the White House just last week as a great program to build resiliency and sort of a nature-based solution. This is a program to implement green infrastructure in city schools to replace concrete and hard infrastructure with more softer green infrastructure where kids can play. It can be a learning environment. It also filters contaminants, deals with stormwater. So it's a sort of a win-win solution. And it's spread across these different city schools. And one of the questions I had was, how are we choosing these schools? Do we know that the schools that are being selected are indeed in environmental justice communities, and we're not picking the easy schools? And in this particular case, we did the analysis, and turns out they are indeed located in neighborhoods that are environmental justice. They're located in census tracts that are considered high on the EJ scores. That need not be the case in other programs, but in this case, this turned out to be a good story. So you can have these issues in implementation. You can have equity in funding, and the federal state revolving fund assistance program, which comes from EPA to individual states, then gives out money to respective communities and water utilities. So city of Milwaukee can get money from the drinking water SRF. And if you look at the last 10 years, only 7% of the systems in the entire country have received this funding across the country. Now, in terms of population served, this is a little better because, as I said, some of the larger systems have more people. So 30%. You still have 70% of the people not benefiting any at all from these federal programs, to which they're actually paying. They're tax-paying customers who are paying taxes and are contributing to the system, but they're not getting the benefit because they're living in smaller systems that have poor capacity. They have no infrastructure, no staffing to undertake a grant writing program to and then be able to manage this grant or a loan program from the federal government. You can have equity in rates. Water rates have been going up significantly higher. So that blue line at the top is water and sewer. Those rates have gone up at a higher rate. They have outpaced inflation. They have outpaced other forms of other expenses like electricity, postage, natural gas expenses. So you can have, again, poor customers who are unable to afford these high, like increasing water rates because, their overall situation is not any better. So, they live in, sort of poor housing conditions. They have uncertain jobs, and so they are unable to keep up with these rates. But this can be a tricky one because you want to keep rates up to make sure that your system is taken care of. The fixes are done. Any kind of new contaminants, if you have filtration needs, you have lead service lines, you have new contaminants like PFAS, you're taking care of that. But at the same time, you are potentially burdening your low income customers who are unable to pay these higher rates. So you can have issues of equity there. There can be equity in trust. This is a statistic that when I first heard, it shocked me, and it continues to shock me. And I hope, even if it doesn't shock you, but at least it surprises you a little. Nearly 60 million Americans. Remember, there are about 350 million Americans, so about 1 in 6, don't drink tap water. So they just don't. They use it for other purposes, like maybe they wash laundry, they water their yard, take a shower, but they actually don't drink it. What do they drink? They drink bottled water, and or other what are called sugary beverages like soda, Coke, Pepsi, Diet, things like that. So this is a chart of bottled water consumption in Philadelphia. And on the bright side is an ad that's pretty common in the part where I live. I live in Virginia, and I've seen this in the DC area pretty commonly. I don't know if you've seen a similar one if you go to a Kroger or Walmart. I've seen this in Walmart and other chains like Safeway and Giant. First of all, this is not a water pipe. You don't have water pipes like this, with a 90-degree bend like this. But at the same time, the idea is to create a fear by looking at it. You're like, ooh, that's rusty. And I don't want to trust anything that comes out of that. And so that's the image that they want to send. And the goal is to make you buy bottled water. So obviously this is an ad for bottled water. And big giant 25-gallon drums are sitting right under this ad. So if you look at Philadelphia, bottled water consumption is reasonably high in Philadelphia, actually. So the city has been trying to figure out how to build trust with the local community. And if you notice the differences, again, the trust issues and the subsequent bottled water consumption is especially high among African Americans and Latinos as compared to white residents. And some of this is correlated, so income and education gaps that you see. So this is a place to build, build equity. You can have equity in communications. If you live in Milwaukee, you probably, or even nearby, any mid-sized, any kind of utility. If you're served by utility, you don't live off a well, then you have a water system that's supposed to put out a report like this every year. It's called a water quality report, or a CCR, Consumer Confidence Report is the official name. And these reports are supposed to tell you what sort of contaminants were tested in the last year, and did they meet a certain goal or a criteria that EPA has said. And if they did not, then what corrective action was taken. And it's meant to inspire confidence. But if you look at a report like this, I'm not sure if it inspires confidence, because you don't understand what's going on. This one is especially bad with the colors, the green colors, just blocking away any kind of text readability. But there are other issues. I mean, most small utilities, most small utilities lack a website. They have little to no social media presence. We've measured accessibility scores. You can measure the reading accessibility of these documents, and they score at a graduate level. So think of a typical resident in your community. They're probably at an 8th grade reading level. They are not able to read and make sense of this. A lot of chemistry and numbers thrown in. And if you have residents who are not fluent in English and speak another language and read, or have limited English readability, then that's another problem, because only about 10% of the CCRs are actually available in a language other than English. In my previous company, we did something called a water data prize. We tried to bring new designs. We invited people to submit. We got a lot of submissions, and that process was highly successful. We shared results with EPA, and some of those will make it to a new regulation that EPA has put out recently. So I'm glad we're making some progress, but long ways to go. And this is something you can do at home. Go and look for your utility and see if you can find the CCR, read and understand. Share it with your family members who are not as fluent and not comfortable with water and chemistry and environmental science, and see if they can read it. So this is something that is a interest to me, because this speaks to the core of how we communicate, how we connect with our residents. You can have equity in leadership. Utility leadership is, sad to say, very monochromatic. Among general managers, this is about a decade-old study. 95% of them were white men. Women and individuals of color are simply not seen in many of the leadership positions. They are in staffing positions, but they don't make it to the top. And remember, there are many, there are about 10,000 senior level positions, and many of the utilities have boards, independent boards. So these are people who don't have expertise in chemistry or water or environmental science. They are people from your community. They are real estate agents, chartered accountants, civic leaders. So those are people just who have expertise in other fields, and they bring that to a water utility. So they can be, so they don't have to be a trained engineer. So you cannot, say that, we don't have women engineers or we don't have Black engineers. You can bring other people into this fold. And so here are two utilities from my region. I live in Northern Virginia, which is right next to DC. It's a fairly affluent, fairly well-educated place, which has, a lot of people with connections to DC. And so it should be easy to find, women, people of color. You don't see that. So that's a problem. Because we want to see people who look like us to inspire trust and confidence in the services that we receive. So when you don't see yourself, sometimes that can cause these kind of mistrust issues. I have talked a lot about broad sort of water services and how we engage in community, but I wanted to obviously touch on Milwaukee and the Great Lakes region, since you sit at the epicenter of water resources for this, not just this country, but for the entire planet. So it only made sense that I talk about Milwaukee. Sometimes you can have lots of problems even with a lot of water. So think of this going back to Chicago. This is a map of Chicago, but this is an analysis that was done for Great Lakes cities. And you look at the water rates. I talked about this in the early part of the talk. these rates are going up, not just nationally, but in certain cities by a whole lot. Look at Cleveland, Detroit, and Duluth as compared to Phoenix. Now, if you were to ask me which city has more water and which one has less, we know the answer, but looking at this chart, your head might go for a spin. Cities with access to water that are sitting right on big, giant lakes that look like oceans have huge problems with water rates because the rates are several times higher than a desert city like Phoenix. Is there a reason for that? The reason has to do with how we set up water rates, how we value water. A lot of the water rates come from the infrastructure costs, not the actual cleaning and transportation. So, if you have a city like Cleveland, Detroit, these are older cities that were set up several years ago. And so they have older infrastructure. Many of the pipes are, I don't want to paint a picture of, decayed, rusted pipes, but they are old. In some cases, in some cities, we still have wooden mains. So they're logs of wood that are just basically bound together through steel rods, and those are carrying water. So you have leakage issues, and it takes money to take care of these pipes and pumps and all of the treatment systems and the filtration devices. So that can be that cost can add up. And cities like Cleveland, Detroit, even Milwaukee, Buffalo, Chicago, I mean, all of these cities have experienced population loss in the last 50 years. They were much more populated. They 50 years ago than they are today, and so that loss in population has created sort of follow-on effects on how we manage our infrastructure. um, Milwaukee in particular has had a long history with water treatment and water chemistry and use of water. So Miller is obviously a company that originated in Milwaukee. Beer does need water, so good water means good beer. Um, Milwaukee is also home to Badger water meter, which quickly realized during the Industrial Revolution that people were buying water, and so there was a business to be made when people are buying water to actually measure. So they've been fairly early innovators of technology in water, and so they've been around trying to build this technology into now more electronic metering systems. And you'll see this is a company that still exists. The last one is actually was a supplier to Ford Motor Company. Now runs as A.O. Smith, which heat water pumps, water heaters, and other devices. So they're sort of well known in the water sector. So Milwaukee has a strong connection to water, and I want to sort of give a shout out to the Water Council, which is based here in Milwaukee. It's a nonprofit group that works on bringing these technology-based companies to Milwaukee and building a water cluster, especially as you're sitting along the lake. Trying to create a hub that prioritizes that gives importance to water as a unique asset that Milwaukee and the Great Lakes region has. So I thought I'll give a shout out to them. Now I talked about a lot of issues and inequity across our system. How are we addressing them? Even making a little progress. So I want to mention some of the recent programs that have been initiated by the federal government. So since the Biden administration came, one of their first action items was this program called Justice 40. It is an executive order. So the goal of that order is to ensure that 40% of the overall benefits of certain, not all of the programs, but certain federal investments, they should flow to disadvantaged communities. And there is a way they define disadvantaged communities, and some of it goes back to our early definitions of what disadvantaged, what disinvested, low income means. So they try to come up with a way to define what is a disadvantaged community, and then targeting certain federal programs at this point. But eventually the goal is to have every federal government initiative to have a goal like that, where you are sending you're making sure that 40% of the benefits actually accrue to them, because otherwise, even despite all this flow of federal investment, you might still see those investments going to more wealthy communities, which even prosper even better. But they leave behind, we sort of leave behind the low income communities. The IIJA is the official name of the bipartisan infrastructure law, which commits hundreds of millions of dollars to several infrastructure programs, including water, but also energy, transportation, broadband, etc. And then Inflation Reduction Act, which also commits a lot of resources towards climate resiliency, flood protection, and drought mitigation. So there's a lot of water / environmental projects, but also other goals. All of these combined, I think, have the potential. I wouldn't say they will, but at least they have the potential to reduce these inequities in our system, because a lot of the imbalance is largely because we don't have funding, we don't have money, and so we are scraping together these different programs from various sources, federal, state, and local. But because now there is this flood of money that's coming in, and there is a targeted investment toward low-income communities, I'm hopeful that we are likely to bridge that gap, even if we don't solve it completely. Some of you may be familiar with this already. If you haven't, this is easy to search. If you search for climate and economic justice screening tool, this is put out by the White House. It basically gives you what I talked about, the disadvantaged community. So the highlighted census tracts in this map are what are called disadvantaged communities. And if you click on each of them, I just typed Milwaukee. It doesn't give an exact, it doesn't like cut out Milwaukee and give it to you. But if you are looking for, I want to know where are the disadvantaged communities next to me where I'm living in Milwaukee, then you can just type in that name, and then you will find, if you click on any of the census tract, it'll tell you why this is disadvantaged. Is it disadvantaged because people have low income, asthma rates are high, lack of access to transportation choices, energy costs are more than average, so it'll lay out, and that can be a good way to assess if you are trying to find a community to interview residents or to set up a program. It sort of gives you this information. There are other similar tools. EPA has a tool called an EJ Screen, which does something similar, has a lot more functionality because you can download the data set, combine with your own data to then create a map of just say city of Milwaukee or Milwaukee County or suburb, and then try to have these kinds of analyses that will tell you if your program is really targeted towards disadvantaged communities, or where should you focus your attention towards. So that's another way. And now I've seen now many states and local county governments and other agencies have their own screening tools like these, and they're using it for their programs. So there's no lack of tools like this. Focusing on community solutions, it obviously easier said than done, but focusing on how can we bring down costs for low income residents? Are there ways we can keep costs low for the entire community by making choices that prioritize long-term resiliency over short-term projects? So because there's a lot of money for what's called a capital cost, building things, are we going to just build a lot of stuff that are shiny and new, but eventually will fall apart, we won't have money to take care of? Or are we actually prioritizing affordability to make sure that we have the resources to take care of our pumps and pipes and communities in the long run? How are we communicating with customers, residents, community leaders, others, to ensure this sort of trust? Training leaders, training people. There's a lot of emphasis now on vocational jobs and getting people trained. There's a lot of job opportunities available in the environment sector, in the water sector. How do we make sure that we are training them? Having community ambassadors, this is the core of trust. We trust people, and we trust their information. So it comes from trusting people, and then whatever they say, it could be a friend, a colleague, a parent, a sibling, a trusted authority, a religious figure. It can be anybody like that who builds and inspires confidence. So can we find those people and train them to be those community ambassadors who then promote trust in our institutions, in our products, where it is warranted. Now, you don't want to be saying that, we have a bunch of community ambassadors go out and build trust in our water systems, even though we have lots of lead service lines. Our water system has had several violations over many years. It has several complaints, workplace harassment, the list goes on. You don't want to be saying that let's build trust in those circumstances, but where it is warranted, we need to make sure that we can actually inspire and build trust. And then constant engagement and input, this is key to any kind of relationship, is not just giving them information in a one unidirectional way, but having sort of a meaningful back and forth. Another solution that to me is one that is right on the table, but we don't seem to consider it because it's like salad. We don't want to eat it, is regionalization. It is proven by data, empirical data and analysis, that smaller systems struggle largely because of the fact that they are too small. They have certain needs that they are not able to meet, and they are just not able to take these shifting priorities, the shocks, because they're just too small. Larger systems, by design, have more people serving. They have more resources. Sometimes even larger systems struggle, but they have the structure, and with a few tweaks they can actually get better at it. So another solution to solve this sort of dilemma is regional entities, where you combine these smaller systems into a one sort of larger regional entity. It's not the same as having the city, because you don't have the density effect. So imagine the city of Milwaukee and all of the suburbs. Now, the city in the Milwaukee city is obviously much dense, so your per unit cost of providing those services is going to be much smaller than doing it in a suburb where people are spread out. They have single family homes. There, some of the communities might be separated by a couple of miles even. So it may not work all the time, and this is just the physical challenges. Then they have you have relational challenges and other issues, but predominantly we are trained to see cities and communities as one entity. We are one town, one village. We want to be like that, so we want to have our own water system, own sewer system. But sometimes shared services can mean sharing treatment, but sometimes sharing operations, just the billing software, having equipment, having staff go around, part-time staff go around. So sharing can be in different ways. But I think it's a meaningful solution that's out there, and we've already perfected this on the wastewater side. If you look at MMST, which is the local utility on the wastewater side for Milwaukee, it serves not just Milwaukee, but I think 27 other communities around the three counties around Milwaukee. Similarly, with Chicago, the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District serves not just Chicago, but 127 communities around Chicago in Cook County. And so these are examples of things that are possible. We have done this, but for other services like drinking water services, we somehow feel that that's not possible. So we've not been able to do that, and I think that just speaks to our lack of imagination in addressing these kinds of easier to solve problems. The other solution that's on the table is public-private partnerships that are helpful to the government, but also helpful from the private side, but also the community benefits when you have faster delivery of services. This is, PPPs have varied in form and structure. They've sometimes not performed as well. So internationally, there's several examples of them sort of failing. But there are many other positive examples of PPPs that have actually worked successfully. They cut down the time, and the private entity takes on the risk. My company does work with MMSD here in Milwaukee, managing the Fresh Coast Protection Partnership. And that's an example of a community-based partnership where you are engaging the public sector and the private sector in a relationship that is beneficial to both the entities. The public sector can benefit from faster services. We always are prone to thinking in terms of cost. So cost saving is definitely there, but you're also saving time, and there's value to that time saving. That can be translated into money in all sorts of senses. Um, this is the example I was talking about, green infrastructure in Milwaukee. There's several projects that MMSD has initiated as part of this. Some of them to do with school education and training, green infrastructure in cityscapes. Similar to the Chicago schools program, Milwaukee also runs. I don't know if they have an actual name for it, but I've visited one of the schools, and it's again a fabulous program where you're setting up green infrastructure in school campus, in school property. Again, lending a sort of a teaching educational component to that, in addition to all of the environmental benefits. So there are great ways to have this partnership that works out for the communities. I wanted to stop here and open this out for questions, and see what sort of thoughts you had on environmental justice and equity. What have you observed, and how we can all learn. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sri. I was just about to post in the Green Schools Initiative here is managed by Reflow. Obviously, our school has an active role in that. We're in our 7th year, so 7th cohort. So I can post that. It's separate from the FCPP program with Corvias, but very, very active with MMSD. They've been really committed to the funding project. So at this time, I'd open it up if you have any questions or comments that you'd like to share. I just have a sort of a general question or comment about the ambassadors. That was very intriguing to me. I know some community groups and neighborhood groups have ambassadors. Near West Side Partners, which is a community or neighborhood directly west of downtown, has ambassadors. They do a fair amount of training, helping them, again, whatever their topic might be. In some cases, it's programming, neighborhood events, safety.
Right.
Do you have some examples from the water equity side that you could share with us, or maybe we could do a little more research on that?
Sure. I think that's an area ripe for research. I don't know many examples, but I know Philadelphia has one. And that's a somewhat well-known example that I know of. Philadelphia has lots of problems. I mean, it's not just the water services. I mean, the city itself, it's a again, similar older city that has, structural issues. Water trust is a key issue with the community there. And they have been championing this idea of ambassadors who are local artists. I mean, we always think of, at least people who are trained in the environmental space and the science, they come from engineering. So they are thinking of units and measurements and scientific stuff. I mean, art can be a great way to, engage people, because, it's non-threatening. It has nothing to do. So Philadelphia is known as a city that does, it's a graffiti city. So it's got a lot of graffiti. And so there are a lot of artists, not surprisingly, within the city roaming around. So if you catch hold of some of them, the city, the public water works, water department has actually been able to engage some of these artists. They've created artists in residence, given them training on what it is that the city is doing, and then having them go to fairs and local farmers markets and things like that. So that's sort of one example that I know. But I think it's a space that has this been successful? What sort of what is the community reaction to it? But also, are other cities trying some versions of this, and where can we sort of take this?
Okay. And we have some general local examples. Mary Miss started most of her water education practice in New York City, but she has done some work with MMSD in Milwaukee. She has a group called Living, I think it's Living City, but they talk about education. So some things incorporating art might be, even printing something on the sidewalk that says, underground are pipes that are carrying water.
Right.
Something simple, but it is playful a little bit with the art side. Yes, thank you, Ryan. So City is Living Laboratory. So we've had her present here. I've worked with her in some of the studios. Again, if I don't see any other questions, so I wrote down a couple notes. The climate and economic justice screening tool. So that we would just Google. You said most cities have that, or is
it's a coverage for the entire US. So you should find any city. It's not specific. It's a US map. So you just type in your city name or the county. It'll find a geographic region that's around it. It doesn't have exact boundaries.
Okay.
at least the version that you see. So this is meant to be much more a general, anybody can look at it. But if you want it to be, if have students, practitioners who actually want to use the data, I think I would direct you to EJ Screen, which is the EPA tool, which is much more sort of data use friendly. So you can download the data set, you can select a specific region, which can be a county, a set of census tracts, and it has those definitions. So then you can actually play with it by looking at all of the background information. And if you have your own data, you can sort of, lay on top of it and, develop.
Okay. So is that data easy? I think from a local municipality, they already
Yeah.
have it. It's just a matter of putting it into a resource that's user friendly, probably, right?
Exactly. And you
Okay.
can go across. So if you're looking at county but not the city, then you have, you can do that in one analysis. So things like that. Yeah.
Okay. So there is a question. What are your thoughts on how the EPA proposed PFAS regulations impact equity? And if you could clarify that for everyone.
Sure. So PFAS are this set of emerging chemicals. It's a class of chemicals that were found in industrial compounds. Typically, Teflon, anything. Teflon is the sort of trade name, but anything that's waterproof. I think I always feel like, even the popcorn that you're making in the microwave, the container has PFAS. Sorry to say that, but it's everywhere. And also used in firefighting foam and several different compounds that we cannot even begin to imagine. So they have found their way in our water systems, drinking water systems, food systems, the air we breathe. It's everywhere. So EPA has control on water systems, so they're saying, hey, let's fix that in water systems. But to be honest, it should be fixed in every other place as well. So what has happened is, by focusing only on water, which is EPA's jurisdiction, at least the Office of Water, what they have done is provided a stringent recommendation for a regulation. It's still in a draft process. So if you are, somebody who wants to read this up and, actually say something to EPA, at the comment period, I think is still open. You should be able to do that. But what it does is, by providing a stringent recommendation for the standard, it means that all of the water systems, likely all, will have to buy new treatment equipment, upgrade their technologies, and basically it's a lot of investment in treatment technologies for drinking water systems. That has definite impacts on equity. So smaller systems will struggle. Larger systems will also not struggle, but they'll take a hit. But because they're large, that's where the size plays a role. Because they're large, a smaller investment, several $1 million in a couple billion utility is a small drop in the pond. But if you are a utility that's only whose revenue is $5 million and you're asked to buy a treatment that's worth $1 million, that's a big part of your revenue then. So it'll start to impact equity, because then those rates, those costs have to be passed on to customers who, again, we talked about this rising curve that is likely to go up even higher. So yes.
It's a requirement that then gets passed on.
It is. So eventually it's a requirement that gets passed on to the customer. Water systems only get about 3 to 4% funding, free money from the government. Everything is a finance. It's a loan. Either it's from the EPA through the SRF, or the utilities go in the bond market, issue bonds, get some loans, and then they have to pay the bondholders eventually. So it is the ratepayers, it is the customers. So if you consume water and have a water bill, you are paying into that water system, over the long term.
Okay, fair. We understand.
Yeah.
A couple more questions. Thank you again for excellent presentation. There's a note. Question is about equity in technology. They're referring that international contractors will bid for projects with the latest state-of-the-art treatment processes. And then the question is, what is your feedback sort of on lower technology in terms of how I think contractors are bidding out, and how does that affect probably the projects as a whole? So I guess a question about technology, we always know a lot of international groups tend to be a little bit more cutting edge and ahead of us, but there's a cost that comes with that. Right.
So, technology is heavily being used in water systems even now. Behind the scenes, we don't notice it. But all of the, there are no like actual operators going and adding chemicals. I mean, this is all done with technology. That's just one example. We have, leak detection systems that are able to detect leaks based on sensors. So there is a lot of technology, and those costs are going to be, they're increasing because it's becoming a regular part now. AI is involved in terms of predictive technology. How can we ensure where is the next leak going to happen, for instance? So these are costs that are going to go up. I'm not exactly familiar with the premise in terms of international, operators having more technology. So I'm not sure if I'm exactly answering that question. But I think the state or the local entity, which is, bidding out, which is the client. I mean, they have to set those standards. So that has to come from. I mean, contractors either match or exceed the standards, and then there is the decision based on the cost. But I think that's where the actual standard has to be set. How much do we need for the next 20, 30 years? And this is a challenge with technology. I mean, we are talking about contracting for the next 20 years, next 30 years, and we don't know what the technology is going to be. So the contracts are starting to be more nimble. In fact, I saw a bond statement from New York State, which is new, slightly different. But I thought that the flexibility in the government processing is typically not there. But because of the high inflation and high interest rates, the state legislature gave authority to the state agency to revise the interest rates midway if they see that, which is typically not how it's done with federal or state, government process. They just set out a process, and it's out in the open, and then you wait for 30 years for it to completely go out of cycle. So I see that's going to be the challenge, is as with new technology, we are going to have to accommodate and figure out how things are going to change in 2050.
Well, you would hope that in some cases, technology is going to make things more efficient and therefore bring costs down. I mean, in a building scale, the auto sensors on faucets, right? That was an environmental decision, but also an effective economic decision, right? To
Right.
save on water. So you'd hope at a broad scale, technology is going to help,
Exactly.
not increase. So, okay.
Right. But it brings other, cybersecurity challenges. I mean, it brings its own ecosystem of costs and benefits that will have to be weighed. Yes.
Okay. So I see one more question. I assume that how utility water quality reports are written and whether or not they have to be translated is based part on state or federal law. Is that correct? And are there any movements in state legislatures or from the feds to make reports more legible for more people?
Yes. Yes to all of the above. So there is there is a federal statute. It is part of the what's called the CCR rule, Consumer Conference Report rule, which was written in 97, 99, maybe. Late, almost pre when internet was widely available. Internet was available, but it was not widely available. So the, let's say, the pre-consumer internet era, rules are written. So some of the standards are still sort of flowing from that. So we still have to abide by those. Some come from the legislative language that EPA derives, what they can do and what local utilities can do. But a lot of flexibility is provided to state agencies who are called primacy agencies. So states give primacy, EPA gives primacy to the states. So the state authority could be the Department of Drinking Water or Department of Health, or some equivalent agency in the state has that authority, and then they ask the utilities to do their own reporting. Now, I see gaps where everyone wants to blame the other. So states will blame the EPA, utilities will blame one of the above, and say, we don't, our hands are tied. They ask us to do something, we're doing it. Frankly, to be honest, if you're creative, there are gaps where you can play around and make improvements. I've written a few articles, so I'm not, going to summarize all of that, but I think there are areas where local utilities have some flexibility. They're just not, they're too, a little scared because these are regulations that EPA oversees. They're just not, they don't want to upset the balance. And so they're a little hesitant to explore and be creative, but I think there is room for that. There is a new regulation. The CCR rule is finally getting updated. There is a draft regulation out there. Again, this is also in a comment phase right now. So if you're interested, feel free to look at it. I was involved in providing recommendations to EPA on this. And I'm glad that not my, but our group's recommendations were given a lot of importance, and they were included. Many of them were included. And that'll make the process a little easier. We advocated for having simplified language and using audits to make sure that they're actually following through availability of these CCRs in other languages, improving readability and all that. So I think there are going to be some improvements. Yet this is a place where local utilities will have some leeway, and they should try to work with their state authority in making those improvements.
I imagine there's a staffing capacity in just taking
There
on
is.
the work, but
Yes.
usually once a few groups take on that leadership role, and there's essentially a tool or some examples to use.
Exactly. So we
then-
did work with I worked with a company called Raftelis in developing what's a template. So we basically said, here's a form template, fill it out, make some edits, and then you can, if you're a really small utility, you don't want to reinvent the whole wheel every time, and you don't have resources to develop and put together this report. So you can use that. Remember, the goal of any kind of document like that is to actually make it transparent, make it accessible to the public. Most people see it as a regulatory document. It is a process that we need to do every year to make sure that we are, we remain in good books. That's one part of it. Certainly you need to do that, but I think the next part is actually making sure that people are reading it, because if not, then what's the point? And why go through the hassle? Just put it up somewhere and say that we've done it. So I think that that's the part where you want to make sure that people read it. So making it more accessible. We are so hung up on providing these numbers and statistics that we are not able to tell whether the water is safe or not. And no, those CCR just don't tell you that.
Yeah, that's a good point. And if there's any of these resources or links that you can share, Jenny does a follow-up email with everyone. And I'll get to the last question in a second. But for those of you who are still here, Jenny will share a survey in the chat box that you can provide some feedback about today's presentation, as well as give us suggestions for topics for next year. And keep in mind that we will work over the summer and early next fall on identifying speakers for the 23-24 school year. And there'll be an email coming from our new department project assistant, and her name is Blythe Walbing. So I would say look for that email. It'll be a new name for you, but it'll be associated with our ICL and Innovative Cities Lecture Series. So there's one final question here asking about the monitoring of the PFAs. So the question is, are there plans to monitor and control major sources of PFAs, since water management right now is not testing for that?
So right now, larger systems are voluntarily testing for PFAS. So they are testing larger systems. It's not a chemical that is regulated. It's called an unregulated. So there is EPA has a lot of complicated processes. So there are some regulated compounds. So like lead is, for instance, arsenic. These are regulated compounds. There is an actual regulation that says this is the amount of chemical that is allowed in the drinking water. Anything more than that, you need to treat it. Anything less than that is okay. PFAS doesn't have that, but they set up a process where they said this: we want to ask some utilities to still test it before making a recommendation for a regulation, because it helps us. Because you want to know if this thing actually exists. If it doesn't exist, then why go through a regulatory process, right? So PFAS is in that right now, but the new draft regulation will change that. It'll change that because it'll make PFAS one of those regulated compounds. So if that rule actually gets implemented, anybody's guess, maybe by the end of this year, they actually pass the rule, give utilities 2 or 3 years to, come up to terms with that. Maybe by 2026, you can say, yes, this is a regulated compound. Every utility has to now test it and then report it. And if they fail to meet that standard, they actually have to figure out a process where they can actually, upgrade their treatment. So, I'll say that, we are getting there in that regard, that you will know, you'll find out, you'll see it on your CCR, maybe 3 or 4 years down the line as a line item. as to whether your utility is meeting, your water is meeting that standard or not.
So that's a question if we know where to find the CCR and we can read it, right?
Right, exactly. So, hard to find. Sometimes they are easy. Go to the website. They'll say, this is actually a good time. July 1st is the deadline for CCRs. So they have to come out by July 1st and post it on the website for mid-sized to larger utilities. So look around July 1st on your utility, you will see that. Sometimes they'll send a note, like a quarterly letter or something. They'll say, in your mail, and it'll say, this is the link, go there. But if you have if you're in Milwaukee, you should be able to find it on your website.
Great. This has been really fascinating. I think not only from a water aspect and health aspect, from the equity aspect, right? How can all of us move that needle a little bit more? And some of the tools you've provided, I think, will be really helpful. So we'll provide some of those as we follow up with the email list here, everybody who's registered. So thank you for coming to Milwaukee for an hour today.
Thank you.
So, and thanks to your team, and I would wish everyone a great summer, that we will be touching base with you again late summer to have you provide a list of the speakers that we have coming. So again, thanks, Sri, for your time and your expertise, and thanks everyone for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for the invite.
Thank you.